The sun was sinking over the wide Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. At 17, Clara still clung to the innocence of childhood, though life had never been easy. Her father's debts grew heavier each day, and her mother's worried eyes followed her with silent prayers. Neighbors whispered of foreclosure and ruin, and Clara's father began spending late nights at the saloon. Promises were made in hushed voices, debts gambled away until the last desperate choice stood at their door, selling Clara's hand to a lonely cowboy twice her age. He was known only as Mason, a reclusive cattleman with a scar that ran down his cheek. The town said he was hard but honest, living alone since his wife's death. Some pitied him, others feared him. Clara knew only that her fate was tied to his name now. The night before she was to leave, Clara sat on the porch steps, clutching her tattered shawl. She dreamed of freedom, of books, of stars beyond the farm. Instead, she was being traded like cattle, her youth exchanged for a handful of dollars her father had already lost. Mason arrived at dawn, his boots striking the earth like a drumbeat. He said little, only nodded at her father, and handed him a leather pouch heavy with coins. Clara's mother wept quietly, pressing a handkerchief into her daughter's palm, whispering, "Don't lose yourself, child." The wagon rolled away, carrying Clara toward a land she had never seen. Dust swirled around her face as Mason's tall figure guided the horses with steady hands. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the creak of the wheels and the wind. Clara stole glances at him, trying to read the man who now controlled her fate. His face was lined and weathered, eyes fixed on the road, lips pressed tight. He did not look cruel, but neither did he look kind. He seemed carved from the same stone as the mountains ahead. The journey stretched on for hours, then days. Mason spoke little, though he provided her food and blankets at night. Still, Clara felt like a shadow trailing after him, unseen, unimportant. Each sunrise carried her further away from her family and childhood dreams. When they reached his ranch, Clara's breath caught. It was vast, surrounded by rolling hills and endless pasture. Horses grazed in the distance and cattle moved like waves across the land. Yet the house itself stood lonely, a wooden frame weathered by storms and silence. Inside, the room smelled of dust and leather. A single chair sat by the fire, shelves lined with worn books, and a photograph of a woman in a faded frame. Clara guessed it was his late wife. She wondered if she was meant to fill that ghost's place. That first night, Mason set a bowl of stew before her without a word. He ate slowly, staring into the fire. Clara ate in silence too, her hands trembling as she lifted the spoon. The crackle of burning wood was the only voice in the room. When she finished, Mason stood. "You'll have your own room," he said at last, his voice deep and rough. "No one will bother you here. Tomorrow you'll help with the chores." He left her there, stunned by the simplicity of his words. Her room was small but clean. A narrow bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the endless fields. She sat on the edge of the mattress, clutching her mother's handkerchief, tears blurring her sight as the wind howled outside. The following morning, Clara rose early. Mason had already started the day, saddling horses, carrying feed, mending fences. He showed her how to milk the cows, how to gather eggs, how to ride without fear. His manner was stern but not unkind. Weeks passed in rhythm. Clara began to know the land, to hear its language in the rustling grass and distant thunder. Mason remained quiet, always working, but she noticed the way he paused when she laughed, the way his gaze softened when she stumbled. Yet loneliness pressed at her heart. She longed for someone to talk to share stories and secrets with. The silence of the ranch became both her cage and her companion. Some nights, she pressed her face to the window, whispering her dreams to the stars. One evening, Mason left a book on her table. "Figured you might like it," he muttered before walking out. Clara opened it with trembling hands. It was a collection of poems, words blooming across the page like wildflowers in her barren world. She read every night, the poems carrying her into places she'd never seen. Mason noticed. "You read real well," he said once. "Better than me," Clara blushed, unsure how to answer. Slowly, something unspoken began to grow between them. Still, the town whispered. When Clara accompanied Mason on supply trips, women stared and men muttered. Some pitied her. Others called her foolish. She held her chin high, though inside she felt the weight of their judgment crushing her. Mason never defended himself, nor her. He simply carried on, buying flour, salt, tools. But Clara saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he gripped the reins tighter on the way home. The world outside judged them, but inside their home, a fragile peace remained. But peace was a delicate thing. One stormy night, the sound of riders shattered the quiet. Mason stood with his rifle, jaw clenched. Clara hid by the window, heart pounding as shadows circled the ranch. The past, it seemed, had come calling for him. The riders' voices were rough, their laughter carrying in the rain. Mason stepped onto the porch, his rifle gleaming in the lightning. "You've no business here," he warned. But they mocked him, calling him a hermit, demanding whiskey and coin. Clara's fear turned her body to stone. When Mason refused, the men grew bolder, circling the house like wolves. Clara clutched the handkerchief in her pocket, praying the walls would hold. Mason fired into the air, the thunder answering his shot. The riders cursed, but finally retreated, vanishing into the storm. Inside, Clara found him standing still, rain dripping from his hat. His hands shook as he laid the rifle down. For the first time, she saw the man beneath the scars, a weary soul who fought the world alone. Without thinking, she brought him a blanket. He didn't speak, only looked at her with eyes that held too many stories. That night, the distance between them shifted. Clara realized Mason was not only her captor, but also a man haunted by ghosts, trapped in his own kind of prison. The next morning, silence returned, but it was softer now. Mason taught her how to ride beyond the ranch, showing her hidden streams and wildflower fields. Clara felt the weight of the town's judgment fade in those open spaces, where no one else's voice mattered. She asked him once about the scar on his face. He paused, then said, "A man I trusted betrayed me. Took more than I can tell." Clara didn't press further, but in her heart, she began to see the pain that shaped him, the reason he lived behind walls of solitude. Seasons shifted, and with them, Clara grew into womanhood. She no longer felt like the frightened girl dragged from her home. She had learned the language of the land, her hands calloused, her spirit stronger. Mason watched quietly, pride flickering in his gaze, yet the town never forgot. Whispers followed them each time they appeared. Rumors grew that Mason had bought himself a child, that Clara was nothing more than property. The cruelty of words weighed heavy, though Mason bore them in silence, his fists clenched at his sides. Clara sometimes wondered what her life might have been had she escaped instead. Yet each time she looked at Mason, she saw not a monster but a man struggling to give her more than the world had given him. The truth was complicated, like the prairie winds. One day Clara discovered a trunk in the attic. Inside lay letters, yellowed with age, written by Mason's late wife. The words spoke of love, longing, and dreams left unfinished. Clara wept quietly, realizing Mason carried wounds deeper than anyone could see. When he found her reading, Mason froze. "She was everything," he said softly, voice breaking. "When she died, I swore I'd never let anyone close again." Clara returned the letters gently, whispering, "You've already let me close." His silence was answer enough. A fragile tenderness grew between them, fragile as glass. Mason began to share more stories, of the war, of betrayal, of the life he had lost. Clara listened, her heart both heavy and light, torn between sorrow and the strange comfort of being needed. One afternoon, Clara fell from a horse, scraping her leg badly. Mason rushed to her side, lifting her with surprising gentleness. As he cleaned the wound, his hands trembled, not from fear of blood, but from the realization of how much he could not bear to lose her. From that day, he grew more protective, watching her with a quiet intensity. Clara felt it too, the bond pulling them closer, though unspoken. What had begun as a forced arrangement was shaping into something neither of them could have predicted, but not everyone approved. The town sheriff visited one evening, warning Mason that talk had reached the church council. "People think it ain't right," he said bluntly. Mason only replied, "People don't live my life." Clara stood silently, her heart pounding. The sheriff left with a warning, but his words lingered. Clara realized their life together could never escape judgment. Yet deep inside, she no longer cared for whispers. What mattered was the quiet truth between them. The way Mason's eyes softened when he looked at her. One night, Clara asked him, Do you regret it? Buying me? Mason's face twisted in pain. Every day, he admitted. But not because of you. Because you deserved a choice I never gave. Her throat tightened, tears stinging. And now? She whispered. Now I thank God you're here, he replied. The confession changed something. For the first time, Mason touched her hand gently, not as an owner, but as a man reaching for hope. Clara let him. The fire crackled beside them, and in that silence the world outside ceased to matter. But fate was not done testing them. The riders who had come before returned one moonless night, demanding more than whiskey this time. They wanted land, cattle, and revenge. Mason stood tall, rifle in hand, while Clara hid in the shadows, her heart racing with terror. Gunfire erupted across the ranch. Horses screamed, bullets splintered wood. Mason fought fiercely, but he was only one man against many. Clara's fear turned to fire. She grabbed the old pistol from the drawer, stepping into the night with trembling hands. She aimed, heart hammering, and fired into the darkness. The shot rang true, scattering the riders long enough for Mason to drive them off. Smoke hung heavy in the air as silence returned, broken only by Clara's ragged breaths. Mason looked at her in shock and pride. Clara's hands shook as the pistol slipped from her grasp. Mason caught her before she fell, pulling her close as the storm of adrenaline faded. You saved us, he whispered, voice raw. Clara's tears fell against his chest, mixing with the scent of gunpowder and rain. That night, Mason sat awake by the fire, watching over her. Clara pretended to sleep, but she felt his gaze heavy with unspoken words. For the first time, she understood. He wasn't just protecting the ranch. He was protecting her, with everything he had left. Days passed as they repaired the damage left by the attack. Mason worked tirelessly, hammering new boards, fixing shattered windows. Clara stood beside him, her hands blistered, her spirit unbroken. They were no longer strangers bound by circumstance. They were partners in survival. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Mason took her hand. You've got more courage than any man I've known, he said. Clara's heart leapt, not from the praise but from the tenderness in his eyes. She realized then that love, fragile and fierce, had taken root. The next trip into town confirmed what Clara already feared. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. People eyed them with suspicion, some with disgust. A preacher's wife muttered loud enough for all to hear, calling Clara a child trapped in sin. Her cheeks burned, but Mason walked on, head high. That night, Clara wept quietly. They'll never see me as anything but a girl you bought, she said. Mason cupped her face gently, answering, Let them talk. They don't know the truth of us. His words were steady, but Clara could hear the pain beneath. The truth was complicated, and yet undeniable. Clara no longer felt like a victim of fate, but a woman who had chosen to stay. Still, she longed for a day when their love would not be questioned, when whispers would fade like shadows in the dawn. Mason tried to shield her from the world's cruelty, but he could not shield her from her own thoughts. Some nights Clara wondered if her mother still prayed for her. Would she see her daughter as broken, or as someone who had carved freedom out of chains? One morning, Clara found Mason mending a saddle. His hands were steady, though his face was drawn. I can't give you the life you deserve, he said quietly. I don't have riches or fine things, only this land, and what little I can offer. Clara answered softly. That's enough. The seasons rolled on, painting the ranch with the colors of change. Spring brought wildflowers that carpeted the fields. Clara walked among them, feeling alive, her laughter carried by the breeze. Mason watched her from the porch, a rare smile breaking across his face. But peace never lasted long. One summer evening, the sheriff returned with news. The riders are stirring trouble again, he warned. They won't forget you stood against them. Mason's jaw tightened. Clara's heart sank, knowing danger still lurked beyond the horizon. She begged him to leave, to take her far from the ranch. But Mason shook his head. This is my home, and now it's yours too. I won't run from them. Clara saw the fire in his eyes, the stubborn pride of a man who had lost too much already. When the riders came again, they came in numbers. The sky thundered with hooves as they surrounded the ranch. Mason stood ready, his rifle in hand. Clara refused to hide this time. If we fall, she said, we fall together. Mason's heart swelled with both fear and love. The battle raged, louder than any storm. Smoke and dust filled the air, bullets tearing through wood. Mason fought fiercely, but Clara's courage shone just as bright. Side by side, they drove back the intruders, until the last rider fled into the night. Exhausted, they collapsed in the dirt, their hands finding each other's. Clara's body ached, but her spirit burned with triumph. "We did it," she whispered. Mason looked at her, eyes shining, and for the first time in years he laughed, a sound rough and beautiful. The town could no longer deny Clara's strength. Word spread of how she had stood with Mason, of how she fought like a lioness to defend her home. The whispers changed tone from scorn to awe. Still, not everyone approved, but respect had begun to replace pity. One evening, Mason brought her to the hill overlooking the ranch. The sun dipped low, setting fire to the horizon. "I can't change the past," he said, "but I can ask you now, will you stay? Not because you must, but because you choose to." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she said simply. "I choose this. I choose you." Mason's hand trembled as he placed a small silver ring, worn and plain, onto her finger. It wasn't riches or grandeur, but it was honest. And in that moment, it was everything. From then on, Clara no longer lived in the shadow of judgment. She rose each morning with purpose, working beside Mason, shaping the ranch into something new. Their life was hard, but it was theirs, built not on a bargain, but on love. And though the world beyond might still whisper, Clara knew the truth. She had been sold once, her innocence traded for coin. But in the end, she had gained something no one could have predicted, a life of her own choosing, and a love forged in fire. Still, the memory of that first night never left her. The fear, the helplessness, the sound of the wagon wheels. It was a scar she carried silently. Yet scars, she realized, did not always mark ruin. Sometimes they marked survival. Mason's scar, her own pain. They were reminders of what had been endured and what had been overcome. Together they were more than the whispers, more than the debts of her father, more than the shadows of the past. Together they were free. The days after their promise were filled with quiet joy. Clara rose each morning not as a girl bound by debt, but as a woman shaping her own life. The ranch no longer felt like exile. It was a place she had chosen, a place she had defended, and now a place she called home. Mason's wound healed slowly, leaving a fresh scar beside the old ones. Yet Clara saw strength in those scars, not weakness. They were proof of survival, of battles fought and endured. She too carried invisible scars, but together, they made them something beautiful. Clara continued to write in her journal, her words flowing like rivers across the pages. She recorded not only the struggles but the small victories, the first bloom of spring, the laughter shared over supper, the way Mason's eyes softened when he looked at her. In town, the whispers shifted. Where once people pitied her, now they spoke of her bravery, of the night she had stood against outlaws with nothing but fire in her spirit. Respect replaced scorn, and Clara walked the streets with her head high. Still, there were days she remembered her mother's tears, the weight of her father's choices. Pain didn't vanish. It lived inside her, a reminder of how far she had come. But instead of breaking her, it fueled her resolve never to be caged again. Mason built a new fence where the old had burned, and Clara planted wildflowers along its edge. Their colors spread across the land like a promise of renewal. Hope, her once fragile foal, now ran strong and free through the fields, just as Clara did in her heart. One night, as stars scattered the sky, Clara and Mason sat by the fire. She leaned against him, listening to the steady beat of his heart. For the first time, she felt not like a guest, not like a debt repaid, but like a partner, equal and chosen. Mason spoke quietly. "I thought my life was done when I buried her. Then you came, and somehow you brought me back." Clara looked up at him, tears shining, and whispered, "And you gave me what no one else did. Freedom to be myself." The land around them was still harsh, still wild, but together they had carved out something rare: peace. The storms that once threatened their lives had passed, leaving behind skies clearer than Clara had ever known. As months turned to years, Clara's story became legend in the town. The girl who had been sold had risen, fought, and chosen her destiny. Her journal grew thicker, filled with ink and dreams, until it was no longer just her story. It was theirs, She would tell it to children one day, perhaps her own. She would tell them of courage, of pain, of love found in the most unlikely place. And she would tell them that freedom is not always given. It is claimed, carved out, defended with fire. Mason grew older, his steps slower, but Clara remained at his side. Their love was quiet, steady, unshaken by time. When storms came again, they faced them together. When laughter filled the house, it echoed in both their hearts. And when she looked back on the girl she once was, the one who sat on a porch, clutching a handkerchief, Clara no longer wept. She honored that girl, for she had carried the strength that brought her here. No one had expected such an ending. The world thought her story would be tragedy. But Clara had turned it into triumph, into love, into a life entirely her own. The ranch was no prison, no bargain. It was her kingdom, built with her hands and heart. On her 21st birthday, Mason brought out her first journal, its pages worn and full. "Read it to me," he asked. Clara opened it, her voice trembling as she read aloud the journey from sorrow to freedom. By the end, Mason's eyes were wet with pride. They sat together as the fire burned low, and Clara realized the truth. The girl who had once been sold was long gone. In her place was a woman who had rewritten her story, every page a testament to resilience and choice. Years later, when Clara herself grew gray, people still told the tale. At 17 she was sold, they said, but she was never broken. She found strength where none believed she could, and she loved a man who gave her the freedom to rise. And Clara, with her journal stacked high, smiled each time she heard it, because though the world remembered her as the girl sold to a lonely cowboy, she knew the truth. She was the woman who turned that fate into firelight and freedom. The wind swept across the plains, carrying whispers of her story into the horizon. And beneath the endless Texas sky, Clara lived on, not as a victim, but as a legend of strength, love, and the power of choosing her own ending.